Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to be here this morning with the distinguished senator from South Dakota, as well as the esteemed senators from both Kansas and Wyoming, to talk about this regulation that is clearly an overreach by the EPA, and it needs to be addressed. And we've got measures to address it. And as the senator from South Dakota said so well, this is a regulation that is a huge problem for our farmers and ranchers, but really, as he said, we've been hearing from almost every industry sector that this is a big-time problem, needs to be addressed now. So as I said, we have legislation both in committee. I have legislation in the Appropriations Committee, the Energy and Water Subcommittee that would address it. The good senator from Wyoming has legislation that he has submitted as filed, and he is requesting a floor vote. But in both cases, whether it's in committee or whether it's here on the floor, what we're saying is give us a chance to vote on this. This is an important issue for the American people, and senators need to indicate where they stand. And I don't know why everybody shouldn't be proud to do that, to vote on this regulatory overreach and to address this challenge for the American people. It's a very straightforward issue, and that's what we're here to discuss and debate this morning, and we sincerely hope, as we continue to highlight this very important problem, that the leadership of this body is willing to step up on behalf of the American people and allow the Senate to address it through its rightful duty, which is to vote on issues important to the American people. And so to continue this important dialogue, I would turn to the senator from Kansas and ask for his comments on behalf of his constituents in his state in terms of what he's hearing and the problems that this Waters of the U.S. proposed regulation put forward by the EPA creates in the great state of Kansas.
I thank the distinguished senator for yielding. Senator Hoeven, thank you for your leadership on this issue and for bringing this to the attention of all members, more especially those of us in our conference, but this should be a bipartisan effort. So I rise today, Mr. President, to join my colleagues in discussing yet another job-stifling and unjustified regulation proposed by this administration. The EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Department of Agriculture, the three horsemen of the regulatory apocalypse, have proposed a rule that, after careful review and study, we believe would allow the EPA to further expand its control of private property under the guise of the Clean Water Act. And they claim that the proposed Waters of the United States rule simply clarifies their scope of jurisdiction. Well, here's the catch. The, quote, clarification is from categorically classifying so-called other waters as regulated, even if the water cannot be navigated and was previously outside of their authority. This proposal is another example of why many Kansans, many farmers and ranchers from Wyoming, South Dakota, and North Dakota feel that their way of life is under attack by the federal government's overreach and overregulation. To date, the Kansas associations of grain and feed, agribusiness retailers, ethanol producers, soybeans, wheat growers, pork producers, livestock, watersheds, golf course superintendents, and the Kansas Cooperative Council all have opposed this rule. Similar organizations in Wyoming and North and South Dakota and all across farm country have also been in contact with their senators. These organizations and their members fear that the EPA will use this rule to further regulate farmers and ranchers, as well as other normal land uses such as building homes. If finalized, this rule could have the EPA requiring a permit for ordinary field work, or the construction of a fence, or even planting crops near certain waters. Kansans are justifiably worried that the permits would be time-consuming, costly, and that the EPA could ultimately deny the permits even for long-standing and normal practices, even practices that help the environment. A friend of mine, Kansas farmer Jim Sipes, he's out there in Manor, Kansas. That's way out there. That's way out there by the Colorado border. Still hasn't got much rain after 3 years. He explains his view, said the only thing that is clear and certain is that under this rule, it will be more difficult to farm and ranch or to make changes to the land, even if those changes would benefit the environment. He knows what he's talking about. For the folks back home, the issue of the EPA trying to control more water, whether or not it is actually navigable, this isn't new. We've had this before. We've been down a similar road before with the agency wanting to regulate all of the water in the country, even in small farm ponds. I would tell my colleagues that no self-respecting duck would ever land. Now, I think maybe that there is a file, Senator Hoeven. I think there's a file down there in the basement of the EPA. It must be a big one. Rural fugitive dust, the navigable waters situation, endangered species, so that the taking of farmers' ground to force them to plant native prairie grass to save the lesser prairie chicken, which we can't even find, on and on and on and on. I think it must be labeled what drives farmers and ranchers crazy. And about every second foggy night, why somebody pulls up that file and we go through the whole thing again. I mean, it isn't like we haven't done this before on this issue. So after personally calling on the EPA and Army Corps to withdraw the proposed rule, I want to make sure that the expansion of regulatory jurisdiction of the waters of the United States, let's shelve it for good. Let's shelve it for good. Last week, I joined the distinguished senator from Wyoming, Senator Barrasso, and the majority of our caucus in introducing the straightforward legislation that prohibits the administrator of the EPA and the Secretary of the Army, for goodness sakes, for finalizing the rule or trying to a similar regulation in the future. Put the file back, just haul it away. Maybe put it somewhere where the hard drive is that Lois Lerner lost. We will continue working here in the Senate as well as the House, either to convince the administration to back off this proposal or, if necessary, to block the agencies from moving forward. We have stopped this type of foolishness before, and I expect that we will be successful again, and I thank my colleagues for their arduous efforts. Senator Hoeven, thank you for leading this.
Mr. President, I'd like to...
Senator from North Dakota.
I'd like to thank, again, the senator from Kansas, somebody who's been involved in agriculture though he's still a very young man, somebody who's been involved in agriculture for a long, long time and certainly understands what goes into farming. And think about it. I mean, farmers and ranchers work the land, but that's also their home. I mean, who knows the land better? Who knows the streams and the potholes and the ditches and the roads? Who knows their land better than a farmer or a rancher? And who's more concerned about it? Really? Who's more concerned about it? That farmer or somebody that works at the EPA here in Washington, D.C.? I think that's important to think about as we look at this kind of regulatory overreach that goes to the very private property rights that, is the foundation of this country. I want to thank the senator from Wyoming for his leadership and for the legislation he's put together that he's filed and that we should be voting on right now and that I'm very pleased to co-sponsor. And I would ask the senator from Wyoming for his comments on this issue and his legislation.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd like to thank my friend and colleague, the former governor of North Dakota, now the senator from North Dakota, who knows these issues very well, and the senator from Kansas, who talked about the administration's overreach and overregulations and the impact that it has on the economy of the United States. And Mr. President, there's very disturbing news out this morning reported by Reuters, headline, "Bad to Worse." U.S. economy shrank more than expected in Q1 of this year. the U.S. economy contracted, not grew, not stayed the same, but contracted, Mr. President, at a much steeper pace than previously estimated in the first quarter. The Commerce Department said on Wednesday gross domestic product fell at a 2.9% annual rate, the economy's worst performance in 5 years. Worst performance in 5 years. Mr. President, it's because of the overreach, the overregulation that's coming out of this administration, and that's why I rise today in support with my colleagues and my colleagues who have very serious concerns about the EPA's proposed Clean Water Act jurisdictional rule. Many, if not all, of these colleagues recently joined me in introducing the Protecting Water and Property Rights of 2014. In fact, 34 senators have co-sponsored this bill. More continue to join the important effort. They have joined this effort because this important and consequential legislation restricts the expansion of federal authority by this EPA, which the EPA is trying to use to encompass all wet areas of farms, of ranches, suburban homes all across America. More specifically, this bill eliminates the administration's proposed rule to implement the expansion of such federal authority. Through this recently proposed rule, federal agencies are attempting to expand the definitions of waters of the United States. They want to include ditches and other dry areas where water flows only for a short duration after a rainfall. But the government wants to control even that. Federal regulations have never defined ditches and other upland drainage features as waters of the U.S., but this proposed rule does, and it will have a huge impact on farmers, on ranchers, on small businesses that need to put a shovel in the ground to make a living. The rule amounts to a federal user fee for farmers and ranchers to use their own land after it rains. It forces suburban homeowners to pay the EPA and Army Corps to use their backyards after a storm. Let's be clear what is proposed in this rule. It takes money away from family farmers and ranchers who just want to grow crops, raise cattle, and it taxes suburban middle-class families that just want to recreate in their own backyard without Uncle Sam bankrupting them for the privilege. This is the worst thing I could think we could do to Americans in this economy, an economy, as I say, Mr. President, that is shrinking. A shrinking economy, not just stagnant, not just sitting there, but actually shrinking. That's why my legislation is endorsed by the American Farm Bureau as well as the American Land Rights Association. And it's because they know how devastating this rule is to farmers, to ranchers, to homeowners, and to other small businesses. Despite what this administration may say and has said about providing flexibility, they use that word for farmers and ranchers in the proposed rule, the farmers and ranchers of America are not deceived. They will not be misled by this administration. According to the June edition of the publication National Cattleman, an article entitled EPA Ag's Exemption for WATUS, Waters of the United States. And let me just point out, Mr. President, the National Cattleman, it is the trusted leader and definitive voice of the beef industry. The trusted leader and definitive voice of the beef industry, the official publication of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. What that front page article says is, although agriculture exemptions are briefly included, they don't come close to meeting the needs of the cattlemen and women across the country. The president of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Bob McCann, stated in the article, for example, wet spots or areas in a pasture that have standing water under this rule could potentially be affected. We now need permission to travel and move cattle across these types of areas. The article lists some other major areas of agriculture not exempted by the EPA's proposed rule when the article states, activities not covered by the exemptions include introduction of new cultivation techniques, planting different crops, changing crops to pasture, changing pasture to crops, changing cropland to orchards and to vineyards, and changing cropland to nurseries. Mr. President, Congress never intended the Clean Water Act to be used this way. The Senate, under Democrat control, never brought legislation, such as the Clean Water Restoration Act, to the floor that would have removed the word navigable from the Clean Water Act. Why? Because they knew it would have been defeated. In fact, 52 bipartisan members, a bipartisan group, majority of the senators voted for the Barrasso amendment that rejected the EPA's proposed guidance to seize all state water during the Water Resources Development Act, Mr. President. Yet this proposed rule by the administration is circumventing Congress by effectively writing navigable out of the Clean Water Act. Just as troubling as ignoring congressional intent, the proposed rule disregards the fundamental tenet embodied in two decisions of the United States Supreme Court. Those are decisions that limit federal jurisdiction. It is particularly troubling that the proposed rule allows the Army Corps and EPA to regulate waters now considered entirely under state jurisdiction. This unprecedented exercise of power will allow the EPA to trump states' rights and wipe out the authority of state and local governments to meet local land and water and use decisions. It's particularly troubling when we've seen no evidence at all that the states are misusing or otherwise failing to meet their responsibilities. Enormous resources will be needed to expand the Clean Water Act federal regulatory program. Not only will there be a host of landowners and project proponents who will now be subject to Clean Water Act's mandates and costs of obtaining permits, but an increase in the number of permits needed will lead to longer delays in actually getting the permits. Increased delays in securing permits will impede a host of economic activities in 50 states, cost thousands of American jobs, farming and ranching, commercial and residential real estate development, electric transmission, transportation projects, bridge repairs, energy development, and mining will all be negatively affected. And Mr. President, this is at a time when the United States has seen our economy shrink. And the Reuters story today talks about shrinkage much more than predicted previously. Regulations like this continue to damage America, damage our country, damage our families, damage our communities, damage the hardworking men and women who want to just go to work, put food on the table for their kids, raise their families, go to work, but yet we have an administration that doesn't seem to see or blinded by a role of big government, blinded from seeing the impact that these onerous, expensive, burdensome regulations are having on the American public and certainly on our economy, as pointed out today in this new release from Reuters about the shrinking of the American economy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
Senator from North Dakota.
I'd like to thank the senator from Wyoming for his leadership on this important issue and pick up on a point that he just expressed. Why aren't we demanding in this body that we vote on legislation to address this proposed regulation? As he said so clearly and eloquently, this is an issue that this Congress rejected. So now when one of the agencies, the EPA, goes around Congress to set up a proposed regulation that does something that the Congress expressly rejected, why in the world aren't we voting on it? It's our responsibility and our right to do so. Mr. President, America's farmers and ranchers and entrepreneurs go to work every day to build a stronger nation. Thanks to these hardworking men and women, we live in a country where there is affordable food at the grocery store, where a dynamic private sector offers Americans the opportunity to achieve a brighter future. In these difficult economic times, the federal government should be doing all it can to empower those who grow our food and those who create jobs. Yet instead, regulators are stifling growth with burdensome regulations that generate cost and uncertainty. Look at the economic data, as the senator from Wyoming said, that came out this morning. What are we doing stifling that entrepreneurial activity, that entrepreneurship, that creativity that makes the American economy go? And this regulation, this proposed regulation, is an example of that, and it touches almost every industry. We're here today talking about our farmers and ranchers, but it goes across all industry sectors. The proposed rule by the Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate the waters of the U.S. is exactly the type of regulation that is hurting our economy, hurting our entrepreneurs, hurting our farmers and our ranchers. The waters of the U.S. rule greatly expands the scope of the Clean Water Act, regulations over America's streams and wetlands. If you take a look at a chart that I brought, I know it's a little hard to see, but I think it demonstrates the incredible reach of this proposed regulation. But if you look at the chart, you can see that it's a real power grab that will enable the EPA to stretch its tentacles far into the countryside and far beyond. It's not just our farmers and ranchers and water in a ditch or water in a field that's there for maybe a week when it rains and the rest of the time it's dry. It affects construction. It affects power plants. It affects stormwater drainage. As a matter of fact, I can't think of anything that it's not going to affect. Is that how our country works now? Instead of the people who are duly elected to pass laws for this country, we stand here and we don't get to vote on any of these issues that we were elected to vote on, and somebody who's not elected in the EPA or the Corps, they put regulations in place that affect virtually every single American? Is that how this works now? Is that what it's come to? Because that's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's going on. The Supreme Court has found that federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act extends to navigable waters. I don't think anyone is arguing about the EPA's ability to regulate the Missouri River or other navigable bodies of water, rivers, lakes. But the Supreme Court also made clear that not all bodies of water are under the EPA's jurisdiction. So under a significant nexus determination, the EPA has decided, well, we don't care what the Supreme Court said. We're going to make sure they're all under our jurisdiction, not pursuant to any law. We're just going to put a regulation in place that enables us to do whatever we want with any body of water, not just navigable bodies of water. And again, that's what I've tried to show on this chart. Ephemeral streams, tributaries, all waters deemed adjacent to any navigable body, including dry ditches, including water in fields that may be there for a short period of time, runoff from storm sewers, you name it. That's not the intent of the law, and that's not the intent of the Supreme Court ruling. And that's why it's so important that we address it here. And that's what we propose to do. In the legislation we've put forward, both here on the floor, the bill filed by the senator from Wyoming, the legislation that I've offered in energy and water, we simply and straightforwardly address this regulation. Mr. President, I ask, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman's time has expired.
I'd ask UC for 2 minutes to wrap up.
Is there objection? Senator from Maryland.
I would have no objection as long as equal time is added to the block that follows for the Democrats.
Is there objection to the senator from Maryland's addendum to your motion?
I have no objection.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, that's our point here. Look, we understand that people bring different points of view to this deliberative body. But the point is this is an important issue that affects virtually all Americans, that affects our economy, that affects our farmers, our ranchers, our businesses, the energy sector, you name it. When we have something of this importance, we have an absolute responsibility to the people of this country to stand up and show where we stand on the issue. Meaning we have a responsibility to vote on this and the other important issues before this body. And that's what we're asking for. We're saying everybody has a right to bring their point of view and their opinion. But we all have a right and a responsibility to vote on these important issues. And that's what we're asking for, is a vote on this important issue for the benefit of the American people. Mr. President, I thank you and I yield the floor.